Good afternoon. Hi, everybody. I'm Evan Lieberman. I'm a professor of political science and director of MIT's Center for International Studies. CIS is really delighted to co-host today's COP30 debriefing as part of our Global Research and Policy Seminar series. And I also want to gratefully acknowledge our co-host, the Climate Policy Center. This is now the third year in which we've hosted a debriefing following the Conference of the Parties, bringing together various individuals from around campus to share their insights about this very important annual international event. And I just want to mention that because there are many people who would have liked to have joined but couldn't, I want to let you know that we're recording today's session. This year we have a really terrific lineup, and I want to make very brief and very incomplete introductions so we can get on with engaging with our speakers. We'll first hear opening remarks from Evelyn Wang, MIT's Vice President for Energy and Climate and Ford Professor of Engineering. After that, each of our panelists will provide just 5 minutes of remarks. First, Bethany Patton, who is the inaugural Executive Director of MIT's Climate Policy Center and a senior lecturer at MIT Sloan. Second, Kent Larson. He's a professor of the practice and director of city science at the MIT Media Lab. Third, Catherine Wolfram is the William Barton Rogers Professor of Energy Economics at Sloan, as well as former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Climate and Energy Economics at the U.S. Treasury. And finally, Andre Zollinger is the Senior Policy Manager at MIT's JPOW Global in the Environment, Energy, and Climate Change sector. Then I might ask a question or two to the panelists before turning it over to all of you. But without further ado, I'm going to welcome Evelyn Wang up.
Well, thank you. It's great to see everyone here today, and thank you for joining us for the COP30 debriefing, which is hosted by the Center for International Studies. It's really a pleasure to welcome all of you, the colleagues that are here, students, researchers, and practitioners whose work spans really the full landscape of climate policy, science, engineering, and governance. And I'm especially really grateful to the speakers here who followed the negotiations closely or were in Belém themselves. I look forward to learning from your insights. This year marks 10 years since the Paris Agreement, an important moment to reflect on what has changed and what still needs to change. Paris reshaped global climate governance by creating a shared framework in which every country has responsibilities and where ambition is intended to rise over time. And we've seen tangible progress. Many more countries now have climate strategies and net zero targets, clean energy technologies that were once niche and now central to global markets. And the range of actors engaged in climate action has expanded dramatically. At the same time, the urgency has only intensified. Emissions remain at record highs. The last several years have been the hottest ever measured, and communities around the world are already experiencing what a year above 1.5 degrees feels like. Paris shifted the trajectory, but it did not close the distance between our goals and our commitments. So I did not attend COP30 myself, so I certainly want to acknowledge that many of you bring deeper firsthand perspectives. But from my vantage point, COP30 reflects the mixed realities that define this moment. There was progress on adaptation, including an agreement to triple global adaptation finance by 2035. There was movement on the loss and damage fund, which remains essential for countries already facing irreversible harms. And the setting, the heart of the Amazon, elevated forests, ecosystems, and indigenous leadership, shaping the tone and substance of the conference in important ways. And at the same time, COP30 underscored the challenges ahead. Most notably, countries were unable to agree on a binding roadmap to phase out fossil fuels. The absence has been widely discussed, and it highlights the complexity of global energy systems, as well as the geopolitical, economic, and development dynamics that shape what countries can accept. It also reinforces that the global process on its own cannot always articulate the pathways the world needs. Three major shifts were visible at COP30. First, adaptation rose to the forefront. The pledge to triple adaptation finance was the most concrete numerical commitment from the conference, even though the mechanisms behind it remain uncertain. Second, forests, land use, and indigenous leadership took center stage. This reflects not only the Amazon setting, but a broader recognition of the links between ecosystems, communities, and resilience. And third, non-state actors demonstrated significant influence. With limited movement on fossil fuel transition and no breakthrough in the formal negotiations, much of the energy and innovation came from universities, corporations, cities, and civil society. And these shifts open important spaces for institutions like MIT to contribute. And from the standpoint of what we're trying to achieve here with the climate project at MIT, the lack of consensus on fossil fuel transition points to where institutions like ours must step up. Phasing down fossil fuels is not a switch. It is a systems transition, one that must keep reliable energy and affordability while scaling cleaner alternatives, modernizing infrastructure, and ensuring that communities are not left behind. And when the global process struggles to articulate a pathway, research institutions have an opportunity and a responsibility to help map what credible pathways look like, grounded in science and engineering, economics, policy, and social understanding. And we also have an opportunity to help define what effective adaptation investments look like. With global commitments rising but delivery models still unclear, there is a significant need for rigorous science-based demonstrations of what resilience looks like in practice. And another opportunity lies in systems integration. COP30's emphasis on forests and food systems and oceans and biodiversity and community resilience aligns strongly with what we're trying to achieve here with the MIT Climate Project, with a systems by systems approach. And the world is asking for integrated climate solutions. And we believe MIT is well positioned to help articulate and test them. And COP30 also reinforced the importance of global partnerships, particularly with institutions in the global south. And the most effective solutions will be those that are locally relevant, co-developed, and rooted in community leadership. So one of the clearest lessons from the past decade and from the reflections coming out of Belém is the climate change is experienced locally. And solutions have to succeed at the community level. And when we center on communities, our goals become much more concrete. And we can ask questions like, are households safer during storms? And do residents have reliable access to clean energy? And is local air and water quality improving? And are ecosystems and livelihoods more resilient? And so our partnerships become more collaborative, where community-centered climate action requires co-design, working with local leaders and residents to understand the priorities and build trust. And our innovations must become more integrated, where communities do not experience mitigation and adaptation as separate categories, where there are microgrids, cooling strategies, and nature-based solutions that are all examples of interventions that serve multiple goals at once. And these integrated multi-benefit solutions are exactly what we're trying to do at the MIT Climate Project and what we're trying to advance together. So as we begin the discussions, I hope we can reflect on two guiding questions. Where did COP30 create openings for practical action, especially in specific communities and regions? And how can MIT, working with partners worldwide, help convert these openings into scalable solutions that improve well-being on the ground? So thank you for being here, and I very much look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thanks, Evelyn, for those terrific remarks. Bethany, you're first.
So thanks for having this and for organizing for sure, and everybody else for attending. I think what I wanted to do was just spend my time mostly focusing on how MIT organized around this year's COP, and then a little bit about impact, and then have the rest of the panelists talk about how their work actually did impact on the ground. So I just thought it would be useful. There's a lot of people sitting in the room, and the first time I heard the word COP and UNFCCC, I thought I knew exactly what it was, and then I went there and I realized I had no idea what it was. And so just if I say the word blue zone, how many people know what that means? Raise your hand. Okay. Green zone, pavilion. Okay. And what about a house, like the EY house or some kind of like, okay, great. So that means that I'm not speaking to the choir, but I can actually tell you a little bit about how it works. Okay, so the Climate Policy Center started thinking about how MIT should engage with the COP process and planning about almost like at the beginning of the year. And while MIT have been engaged in COPs for decades, coordinated approach was kind of a new concept. And the idea was that, we have the new climate project, we have the Climate Policy Center. How are we going to show up as a unit rather than individual parts, which is really what the purpose of all of this work around climate is supposed to be. So some of our key considerations were what kind of impact can we have? How do we negotiate the logistics, which it comes to no surprise here to anyone that they were very difficult to navigate. How does the alignment of MIT research sort of overlay with the COP themes that had been started, that the presidency had been starting to communicate, and of course, cost. So there's different ways that MIT can be involved. The blue zone is the official negotiation area. This is where the delegates meet and negotiate over points, and have been doing this for decades. We're given a small allotment of badges for the blue zone, MIT. So in years past, we've had anywhere from 7 badges to 2, which is what we've had for the past couple of years. So 2 badges for all of MIT is a very small number. And so you have to kind of figure out what can we do with those 2 badges. Now, a blue zone badge means you get to go into the blue zone, but of course we don't have any part in the negotiations. We can observe them and watch them and study them, but we don't have any direct impact on the negotiations. So really where our influence ends up being is on the sidelines. And that's where on the sidelines, or we can have more direct influence, which is what you'll hear specifically through Catherine's work and a little bit of the climate policy work. So what it means on the sidelines is that if we have the Blue Zone Pass, we can be there and we can speak on panels, we can have meetings, we can talk to the media, we can do press releases or press conferences if we want to, all in amplifying the work that we're doing so that hopefully it gets to the delegates, it trickles to the delegates and starts to inform the global dialogue. So Traditionally, we have done that. So we have a Blue Zone badge, and then we also sit on panels and talk and do these other things. And MIT always organizes an official side event. So this year, our official side event was Urban Mitigation and Adaptation, Academic Partnerships with Implementing Agencies for Climate Solutions. And we did that with Columbia, correct? And some other universities. So that's an official event. MIT's logo is on it. It's a side event. It's shown on the official agenda. So that's a way of kind of amplifying our presence and showing that we're there. So this is the official Blue Zone. This is how we can influence in the Blue Zone. We can also influence in the Green Zone, which is not an official badged event, but anybody can go. And there can be pavilions and booths and ways that you can sit on those and influence the dialogue there. And then also there are these houses that sort of pop up everywhere where there's programming that's a little less formal and sort of organized and marketed through those organizing bodies. So when we were deciding what kind of presence we wanted, it was, do we want to go all in and purchase a booth in the Blue Zone? Do we want to do it in the Green Zone? Do we want to have participation in a house? And ultimately what we decided was that a pavilion is a huge undertaking. It requires us to have programming throughout the 2 weeks. It doesn't guarantee that you actually have more badges. So we may have still only had 2 badges, and then who was going to sit on our panels. So we ultimately decided no pavilion. We'll just participate as participants on panels, and then we'll focus our attention at a house outside of the Blue Zone. So we were lucky through the MIT Latin American office to establish a relationship with an on-the-ground unit in Brazil who introduced us to EY, Ernst & Young, who had a house. And through that, we were able to do a bunch of programming that focused around, that sort of integrated the thematic, the themes of the COP, as well as the work that we're all doing. So in terms of our impact there, we had 16 faculty, staff, and grad students from 8 DLCs at MIT in Belém on the ground. We organized 35 plus events. We're still getting some details back. 35 plus events total. 12 were organized by MIT and 11 were actually in the Blue Zone. So this is great impact, especially with only 2 Blue Zone badges. And then in terms of when we say impact, we can go from, like I said, we can speak on panels, but we can also start to influence the dialogue. So one way that the Climate Policy Center was able to do this was through what is called the technology mechanism. A lot of what happens with the negotiations is that you start by setting the global agenda, and then these secretariats are set up who are then trying to implement different kinds of policy, and technology policy is one of those ways. The technology mechanism looks at both policy recommendations as well as implementation recommendations. And so over the past couple of years, we've been helping advise on buildings and energy efficiency policy. And we're part of publishing a policy brief, which you can find online. That is called, I can actually show it to you all, although it has all my notes on it, is called it's the draft recommendations to COP and the CMA on deploying established climate technologies and solutions for buildings. So this is now an official document. It was published in collaboration with Global ABC, which is the official secretariat of this technology mechanism. And we're really excited about that kind of impact. And then we hope that countries will adopt those recommendations when they're thinking about decarbonizing their buildings. So that's me, and I will pass it off.
Terrific. Thanks. Kent.
Great. I'm going to show a few slides and stand up so I can see them. So just a summary of what we did at COP. We actually had 10 different events. The City Science, I run the City Science group at the MIT Media Lab. We did 2 official Blue Zone events. We did multiple events at the EY house, and we also did outside things. I'll show you when we first got there, prior to the opening, we opened an exhibition that was in downtown Belém, and it was called Future Ancestral Amazonia. This was really interesting. This was directed by one of my PhD students who's from Brazil. We worked with local craftsmen and some of the indigenous people It was a speculative look at the future of Amazonia, maybe in 50 years, when sea level has risen and there's some degradation of the environment. And what might that future be? And so this involves some mythology and ancient traditions and artistry by the local community. It was a story with interludes, and during the interludes, people could hop under this hat built by one of the local Amazonian craftsmen and interact with it. It was actually great fun. Then we got very serious the next morning in the Blue Zone. This was a program looking at AI and the future of cities and its impact on it. It was with Kristen Dunlop, that runs the biggest climate agency in Europe, and colleague Martin Weinstein, who I've worked with for many years. It was really interesting because we showed up, there was a bank of the AV people, 2 cameras, but they forgot to put in the screen and the projector. So we grabbed a little monitor and treated it like a recording studio. We had a pretty good online crowd, and in the end, it worked out fine. A lot of chaos at COP this year, I found. It gave us an opportunity to announce that we have formed a collaboration with the Norman Foster Institute on Sustainable Cities that I co-direct with Norman and my MIT City Science Group. And one of the things we'll be looking at is informal settlements. So the next day, we actually went into an informal settlement in Belém. This is shot out the window of the car. They have there these incredible community centers, Usina do Paz. And you can see it's right in the middle of the settlement. And we were treated to a beautiful lunch that these ladies built. Now, these are classes mostly for women who have experienced some trauma. And it's therapy. About 1/3 of the people who graduate go on in the restaurant industry. The others are really taking it to recover. But it was really fascinating. They also had dance classes. They have health classes. They have job training. They have a little fab lab for students. This was a dance performance that they developed for us. I mean, just marvelous people. This actually was much more interesting to me than anything happening in the Blue Zone. Then we did the multiple projects at the EY House. This was one of them. We have an international network of cities that we collaborate with, so that gave us an opportunity to talk about that network. This is our affiliated labs around the world. And here's Luis Alonso, who's over here, who was my partner during this week, talking about, in this case, the City Science Lab at Hamburg. We did the official MIT event, which, as Bethany said, it was urban mitigation and adaptation. We talked about the way the cities are an important part of the solution to global warming. And our colleague from Columbia talked about how cities are at the front lines of the impact of global warming and how they have to adapt. Unfortunately, I had my phone grabbed out of my hand by a thief on a motorcycle who had access to my account. So I had to rush back to the US. Luis took over. No problem. They didn't get anything. But this was Luis at that session. We had some really amazing food in Belém. They say the best food in Brazil is in Pará, where Belém is. I was able to go out and experience some of the local culture and the local music. And you should not go to Brazil without hearing live music. We took a little boat trip into the Amazon. This is Gabriela, my PhD student, and experiencing a little waterway that was just extraordinarily beautiful. Anyway, reflections on COP30. I'm going to go really quickly. Sustainability is really about balancing the present and the future. I found that that's out of skew, that there's too much talk about the future and not enough about the present. And by the same token, it's classically defined as balancing the social, economic, environmental impact, and I find that skewed as well. particularly at a place like COP. The social and the economic, it's discussed, but not nearly as much as the future and the environmental. And I think we have to put that back in balance in the conversation, because there's some serious political impacts of not keeping this in balance. So we look for these win-win-wins. We also look for solutions that can combine design technology and public policy. As Evelyn was talking about, really a kind of a balanced, holistic view. And too often the discussion's too skewed, in my opinion, towards technology. And these series of talks at COP gave us an opportunity to talk about this challenge of reaching something like 2.5 tons of carbon per person per year if you have 80% chance of limiting global warming 2 degrees. So that's out of the IPC report. Kendall Square here is about 17.9. I was in Doha last week. It's estimated to be about 35. That's much larger than 2.5. So we look at then all of the interventions that could have impact. And as Evelyn said, I think we need to pay attention to the community scale. In fact, I think much of it has to do with settlement patterns, getting housing in sync with jobs and amenities and providing appropriate local transportation, et cetera. I'm not going to get into that detail. Also went to a session with Gavin Newsom. His talk wasn't great, but he emphasized that in today's world with increasingly dysfunctional national governments, it falls to the mayors and the governors to take action. And those actions, typically the most impactful, involve public policy. They involve zoning and permitting and building codes and incentives. And that's what we're focused on. So that was our week in Belém. Thank you.
Right, Catherine.
I'm next.
Yes.
All right. Thanks so much. I'm Catherine Wolfram. I'm a professor at MIT Sloan. I wanted to talk about 3 things. I wanted to talk about COP in general. I wanted to talk about the fact that it was in Belém. And then I wanted to talk about some work that I've been doing that got some attention at COP. So first, on the COPs in general, as Bethany and Evelyn have emphasized, a lot of what's reported out is about the formal negotiations, right? Do they mention the word fossil fuels? Do they promise to do something by 2035? And I will admit that I'm a little skeptical of that process. I mean, I think history has shown us that promises that are made in the COP negotiation process are not always kept. So like in 2015, the high-income countries promised to spend $100 billion a year for low and middle-income countries to help them mitigate climate change. We didn't achieve that goal until like 2022. So in some ways, like a lot of what comes out of the negotiations is just words and words without, any punishment or any consequences of not adhering to those words. So I've had that skeptical view for a while, and I finally decided I should actually attend COP and see what it's all about. And I will admit that my skepticism has diminished a little. I haven't gotten rid of it. I still think it's just words, but I think that they're important words and they do kind of frame the way that people talk about things. So at Paris, we started talking about 1.5 degrees centigrade as this temperature target. And that really kind of informed the conversation and got into the way a lot of people talked about it. So I don't know, the formal negotiations are there. They come out with these words. People pay a lot of attention to the words. Another thing that goes on at the COPs, though, is what Bethany described, all the kind of side events. A colleague of mine describes it as a climate expo. It's basically like the biggest climate conference that the world has every year. And with that role, it brings all these world leaders, like the governor, a bunch of countries, not the US, but a bunch of countries sent their president equivalent to Belém, and they're all there to talk about climate. And so that, brings together a bunch of people, selects the people who are so committed to climate that they want to fly 14, 18 hours to get to Belém, and puts them together. And so I have experienced that it gives you really good access to people that you might not otherwise see. So for example, in the lead up to COP there's something called the Leaders Summit right before the official COP. I was invited to a 12-person meeting, and 5 of the 12 people were people that like you read about in the newspaper almost daily. So one of them, probably the most prominent, was Ursula von der Leyen. I have my like fan photo with Ursula von der Leyen. I told my brother, and he's like, that sounds familiar, but who is that? So in case you're in the same position, she's the president of the European Commission. So like she was shaking Trump's hand when the EU and the US had a deal on trade. So she was one of the 12. A couple of the other 12 were famous people as well. So like there's no way that I would get invited to a meeting with Ursula von der Leyen anywhere outside of COP. Okay, so Belém itself, there was a fair amount of pushback on Brazil not to have the COP in Rio. Like Rio had just hosted the Olympics in 2016. It's got a bunch of 5-star hotels, like convention centers. It's much easier to get to than to get to Belém. And so people were very critical of Brazil for hosting it in COP. In Belém, I came to believe that it was a very inspired choice. And I really think that it kind of centered the Amazon and made people think about the Amazon in a way that they wouldn't if it had just been in Belém. So, just as kind of a couple of examples, the foods that you get in Belém, they're just like fruits and vegetables that I'd never heard of and that you'll never experience anywhere out. They're not like commercially harvested. So that was cool. That reminds you of the importance of biodiversity. In flying to Belém, it's like this is part of the problem of having Mercator projections. Brazil is a pretty big country. We don't realize it with the way that some of the maps show it, but it's 3.5 hours to fly from Sao Paulo to Belém. A lot of that is over the Amazon. The Amazon is just enormous. And then flying back, I was flying at night and you see fires in the Amazon. And so it's a reminder of like the destruction that's happening. Finally, Belém's like kind of a poor middle income city, and the accommodations were not ideal. They were not 5-star hotels, and it was really freaking hot. Like the negotiations, I swear the average temperature in the tent where the negotiations were happening was probably 82, 83 degrees. People were sweating. They sent out notices about how you could like wear comfortable clothing, but it was a reminder, pretty stark reminder about why we were there. Okay, so why was I there in particular? Why do I get invited to meetings with Ursula von der Leyen? I'm an economist, and for an economist, the most straightforward way to deal with climate change is to make polluters pay for carbon emissions. It's called carbon pricing. It's something that has not gotten a lot of play in the US, but a lot of other countries are making progress on carbon pricing. And so I've been working with colleagues to promote what we're calling a climate coalition, which is a coalition of countries that commit to carbon pricing and that commit to imposing some penalties on countries that stay out of the coalition, the countries that don't price carbon. And luckily, the Brazilian government promoted this. They introduced what's called a declaration, and they got 18 countries to agree to this idea of the climate coalition, including the EU, China, Canada, Mexico, so big emitters, big countries. Why is it important? I'll give you 3 reasons and then I'll close. It's important, I think, to remind people just how effective carbon pricing is. It's not the only way to deal with climate change for sure, but it's a very crucial mechanism and one that, as I say, in the US has not been given much play, but in a lot of other countries is being elevated. And so this is kind of countries coming together and agreeing to work together to implement good policies. Secondly, it emphasized that you can make progress without having 190 plus countries agree. So with the UNFCCC and the COP official negotiations, you have to get consensus. with something like the coalition, you can make progress with 18 countries, especially if those 18 countries account for 40% of the global emissions, because you've got China and the EU and other big emitters in there. And so it emphasizes that kind of complementary to the COP process, you can have these what are called minilateral or plurilateral approaches. And finally, importantly, at this COP, it emphasizes that we can make progress without the US at the table. So the US withdrawing from Paris made it very clear that there are kind of holes or chinks in the UNFCCC approach that relies on consensus, because you can have countries withdraw from that consensus. And so I think something like this minilateral approach suggests, look, we don't have to have every country there. We can make some progress without it. So happy to talk in more detail. There was an article in the Indian News to get today on the coalition if you have more questions about it. But yeah, happy to go to the Q&A at some point. Thanks.
Thanks.
Right. Great. So I'm Andre Zollinger. I'm a policy manager at JPAL, so the Poverty Action Lab, where I manage the environment, energy, climate portfolio. And I want to start actually by thanking MIT. So this is the third time I've been to COP. And I want to say it was a logistically, like other people mentioned, logistically challenging COP, but also very rewarding. And I think, you know, it wouldn't have been nearly as smooth or successful if it wasn't for Bethany and everybody else who contributed to making this work out for us. I was also joined by JPAL's co-founder and director, Professor Esther Duflo, and Paula Pedro, the executive director for JPAL in Latin America. So we have a regional office in São Paulo in Brazil. So this made it a very meaningful COP for us as well as JPAL. As others mentioned, I think COP30 in Belém was bound to be unique from the moment President Lula announced that it was going to be held in Belém and not in Rio, as others were pressuring him to do. I agree also that it was an inspired choice. I think we all know that the Amazon matters because it's one of the main regulators of the Earth's climate. But also, when you're there, you also think about the millions of people that live there, who are some of the people who are going to suffer the most from climate change because they live in places that are already hot, that are going to become hotter, and they don't have the means to adapt as much as, for example, here or in other global north countries. And so I think, it was a defining moment, not only for the climate negotiations, and that's certainly part of what's happening at COP, but for the rest of the climate expo in terms of thinking about how do we advance, evidence-based solutions. So the COP presidency from the beginning said this needs to be a COP about implementation. We have 30 other COPs focused on the negotiations part, goals, putting things on paper. We have to talk about how to get to those goals. And I think that was a very productive way to frame COP. So I'll share a little bit of my reflections and takeaways. Then I'll talk specifically about JPAL's work and how it fits into this part of COP and what's the momentum we think going forward. So stepping back, what has COP achieved over time? Other people have alluded to this already, but 10 years ago, when the Paris Accords were signed, most of the projections for business as usual estimates were going towards 4 degrees almost warming, 4 degrees Celsius. Right now, it's about a degree lower than that. So it's about 2.7, almost 3 degrees. So this is still way above what we need to achieve, between 1.5 and 2 at most. But it's a sign that potentially we can be skeptical about specifically what the negotiations are achieving. But I think the fact that we're getting so many people together and that this is a growing movement, it makes climate a thing in a way that maybe 15, 20 years ago was just a few hundred people talking about these negotiations. Now we have 50,000 people descending upon Belém. A couple of years ago in Dubai, I think it was 75,000 people. And these kinds of things, they cut both ways, right? There was an article on the front page of the New York Times today about the presence of oil and gas in COPs increasing. So there's all kinds of people, all kinds of industries that are present, but it does mean that the conversation is real and that not only in the negotiations, but in the side events, there's opportunities to engage in a way that didn't exist before. The notable difference of the lack of a U.S. presence, for me, it was less direct because as JPAL, we work very deeply with government partners. So we were talking in the Tanzania pavilion and the pavilion of the Brazilian Agricultural Research Agency and the COP presidency. So there was a huge demand for evidence-based policies and understanding evidence. And so there were lots of opportunities to share evidence with all of these different players and partners. And we are anchored by our regional office in Latin America, which allowed us to engage further with local actors. But usually in the other COPs that I've been to, the US Pavilion is a place to showcase US innovations, whether that's in tech or in policy, or major US investments in international aid like USAID, and thinking about how adaptation can help people in the lowest income communities around the world. And so the absence of this was not just a missed opportunity for the US, but something quite concerning in terms of how US presence that can be a positive force was receding. For us specifically, as the Poverty Action Lab, our mission is to fight poverty, to further international development by informing policy with evidence. So, having 2-3 days at COP was a way to accelerate conversations that would take months or years to happen and sometimes may never happen, and just being able to meet all of these people in the same place at the same time. There were two main goals for us. So one of them was sharing evidence from our global R&D fund for climate policy. So we have something called the King Climate Action Initiative, which is a fund for the last 5 years that's been producing research and solutions, not just in learning about what kinds of technologies work, but actually testing them out in the field and understanding how do we get farmers to take up flood-tolerant seeds? How do we help governments in low and middle-income countries to use emissions trading schemes to reduce pollutions and to reduce emissions? How do we help agriculture extension programs with rainwater harvesting in the Sahel and so on and so forth? So we have a number of innovations coming out of this portfolio that are useful for these government partners and private partners to learn about. And so that was one of our major goals. And then the second one, this being in Brazil, we worked with our Latin American Caribbean office to position ourselves to launch a platform called the Amazonian Livelihoods Lab that's going to generate evidence and scale projects in the Amazon at the intersection of livelihoods and climate. And so this was a perfect place, also with Professor Duflo's presence, to launch that. And so I think the emerging momentum that we see is that there is incredible appetite and demand from policymakers. We had an event at the Ernst & Young House on payments for ecosystem services, so conditional cash transfers to protect forests, that was attended by several governments and NGOs. And we are looking forward to being able to share more of these kinds of advice and successful research projects so that governments can take it up and actually scale it up in their own countries. So that's all for me. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, thanks to all of you for those terrific comments. I'm reminded of, I saw Bethany when we were at the COP two years previously in Dubai, and I think we had it was, sounds like it was easier logistics for that in Dubai for that one. But let me turn to the audience because we don't have a lot of time, and I want to make sure that people who have questions are able to ask them. Yeah.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the trajectory around these. I think you used the term lateral, sort of like offshoot.
Mini lateral. Yeah.
Mini laterals. As we continue to experience what the COP can and can't quite do in the big collective I noted with interest, for instance, the announcement of the first gathering of 20 some odd countries around the phase out of fossil fuels that's been announced. I assume that's a kind of mini lateral. And like, how are we thinking about these mini laterals as a productive place to be working?
I mean, I think they're essential. I think in order to implement stuff that's not at a lowest common denominator, we've got to find a subset of countries. It's no surprise that like Russia and Saudi Arabia, these big petrostates, are arguing against saying something bad about fossil fuels. So like, let's try to work without countries like that. So you might say, well, like, why do we need the COP to do that? I do think that an additional role that the COP plays is it's this forcing mechanism. It's a time when the world is going to get together, when all of media is going to write something about climate. And so if you're going to make a big announcement, you better have it ready for the COP. So for instance, the thing I was working on, in the end, Brazil put out like a 500 word, not terribly long declaration. If they hadn't had that forcing mechanism, they could have spent a long time figuring out what those 500 words are, like gone back and forth with China about whether they were going to sign on to the declaration. But because there's this date by when they're going to make an announcement, it forces action, I think.
Okay.
My name is Campbell, and I actually was in Boston on the COVID day with the suitable solution that is associated with that. Going back to the question that we posed on unilateralism, and the imposition of carbon taxes voluntarily to reflect the externalities. To what extent is your proposal, does it include penalties to be imposed against those that are not part? And to what extent are you anticipating what's called slight negative reactions to that?
Yeah, the important question. I didn't say this, but it should emphasize that it's focused on carbon pricing in the heavy industries. So aluminum, steel, aluminum, steel, cement, and fertilizer at first. It's also, Brazil named it an open coalition. So it's open to any country to join. As you say, it's voluntary, but it's not free. You have to do something to join the coalition. And I should emphasize, this is my view of the coalition. Whether that's what the thing that Brazil announced will evolve into remains to be seen. But remaining out of the coalition, what the EU has done is saying if you export anything into coalition countries, then you have to pay. That's kind of the penalty for not being in the coalition. Then your firms are sending money to coalition country firms. Or coalition country governments. I've thought a lot about how the Trump administration might react. A couple things. One, even if they're not in the coalition, the U.S. benefits from there being a coalition because the U.S. is a pretty clean producer in these sectors. And so a world that prices carbon is a world that wants more U.S. aluminum. And so it's kind of good for the U.S. aluminum industry. Now, whether economic considerations will influence Trump's reaction to it is always a question. I think the other thing is that it's like technicals kind of flying below the radar. The news reported about it today, but it's not getting a ton of attention. So if it's not on Fox News every day, like why bother interfering with it? And I think we're solving for a long run problem and it's not always going to be Trump. And so like doing something that will hopefully encourage the US to get to the right place eventually is part of the benefit of having a coalition.
Can I ask you, you said something about the fact that you felt that the COP was focused too much on the future. And Catherine was just saying we're solving for a long run problem. Can you say a little bit more about what you had in mind?
Oh, did I say too much on the future?
No. She
Okay.
did. But you were just mentioning that we were solving for the future.
Well, no, I mean, obviously we have to think about the future, but I think the, political reality is the people generally in the US particularly think about the present and they think about the short-term economic impact. And I think, we've set the mission back significantly by not presenting that to people in a way they can accept, that they see the benefit of taking action to make the future better without implying that it's asking too much sacrifice in the present. And one of the reasons we're focused on these more bottom-up community solutions is that you can, I think, present it as a win-win. You can gain economically by developing jobs and money in the local economy. You can benefit socially, making communities more livable and safe. And if you do it in the right way, you dramatically lower carbon emissions. So we look for those win-win-win. If it's longer term and involves sacrifice, I think you lose many of the people, and that's frankly what put the Republicans in charge, and one of the contributing factors.
Thanks. Other questions? Yes.
So I was in Sao Paulo and Belém for a couple of days, and had one day where I was on past those friends that were. When I walked into the COP, the first thing you saw was the China Pavilion. It was a marquee spot. And my experience of the US being absent, and this is my first COP, so I hadn't been there to see what the US Pavilion actually provided. But what I saw was that the vacuum was being filled by government, somebody mentioned the state level thing, right? This plurilateral kind of negotiations thing, and China. The China Pavilion was crowded with people for a variety of reasons, including giveaways. But also they had a speaker lineup on the day that I was there that talked about kind of the reactivation of, when they had translation of headphones up, to talk about the reactivation of the Belt and Road Initiative. And in their pavilion, there were posters touting all of their massive domestic accomplishments in terms of renewable energy, mobility electrification, and then kind of building towards a narrative of like, we can help you do this in all these other countries, and we're here to help. And we have an MOU with the UN OPS, which is the Office of Product Services, to do these kinds of operational things. Given that we're in the CIS kind of context here, the kind of geopolitical kind of narrative, think about the geopolitical narrative here. What did you all see as far as China's role as you were in more of it? I was there mostly for kind of the investment crowd, not so much the government negotiation crowd. How should we be thinking about China's role in this process? I know that you mentioned they're part of this coalition. Do you see them stepping in? How should we think about that?
Well, I mean, China, we have a city science lab in Shanghai, so we're connected to that, and they're entirely top down. They can make these big decisions very quickly with big impact both good and bad. And unlike the messiness of our democracy where things happen slowly. So you have to be a little jealous of what China can do in terms of what they do with their transit and the bike lanes now that have sprung up in Shanghai, just incredible. And producing, solar panels, et cetera. And so I think there are things we can learn from China, hopefully. And but they've lost the bottom up, engagement with the local communities, and so it's way skewed to the top down. And I think in our country, I think it's now skewing to the bottom up for making these decisions, local communities. What that means for the future, I don't know. I have no idea.
First of all, I completely agree that US not being there has ceded some power to other potential leaders. I remember, so I was in the Biden administration until the end of 2022. And then in the year after that, I was at literally 3 conferences where someone from Chile, someone from Nigeria, used the phrase whole of government approach to climate. And that's exactly what the US was talking about. So this, like, the US just influences the conversation in these subtle but important ways. And so the US very clearly not being there leaves the opening for others. My own sense is that China is stepping into that leadership role a little bit tentatively. That China, like, very much wants the world to go down the clean energy route and not the drill baby drill route. And they've invested heavily, as you said, in electric vehicles, in, you know, electrolyzers and all these things that we'll need to decarbonize. But I don't know. I guess I'd be curious to hear real international relations. But my sense is that, like, China wants to do what China wants to do. They were very opposed to the fossil fuel language because it would have imposed a specific timeline on how we transition away from fossil fuels. And China did not want to be told, like, what that timeline should be. It wanted to make its own decision about timelines. So I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the next couple of years, how much they step into the leadership vacuum.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we are at time. I really want to thank all of our panelists and Evelyn Wang. It was a really terrific discussion, and we learned a lot from all of your reflections on this COP30. And assuming there's a COP31, we'll be here same time, same place next year. Thanks very much.
It's fun.
Yeah, there is COP30.